Howdy folks, and welcome back to War Thunder with the mighty Jingles. And before we actually get started on today's air-realistic battle, I just need to put things into some kind of context for you, because the battle that you're about to see is going to be quite unlike most air-realistic battles that I do show here on YouTube. And it's different because of the aircraft that's going to be flown. Not this one, this is the MiG-19, a battle rating 10 supersonic jet aircraft. I'm just showing you this for the sake of comparison. It has a top speed, without those two missiles loaded, of 1,454 kilometers per hour. This, on the other hand, is the MiG-21, and it has a quite frankly ridiculous top speed of 2,205 kilometers per hour, more than twice the speed of sound. It's basically just a great big afterburning turbojet engine with a couple of wings and a cockpit strapped on. And it sits right at the top of the Soviet aviation tech tree. So, it's great, yeah? Well, kind of yes, and kind of no. And I'll show you why. Let's just take a quick look at the modifications. Here are the air-to-air missiles. It can equip 2 of them once you've unlocked them, and they're a 3rd tier upgrade, which means that you're going to be grinding out the research points that you need to fit those 2 missiles using the gun. That's right, gun, singular. It carries exactly 1. It is a 30mm gun, so it's pretty powerful, but it is just 1 gun. So by default the MiG-21 has a quarter of the firepower of, for example, the Hawker Hunter F1, and that single 30mm gun comes with only 60 rounds of ammunition. So bearing in mind that we're about to watch a MiG-21 realistic battle replay, you probably shouldn't expect to see anybody shooting down 11 aircraft. Because while that's theoretically possible, when you have a single gun that only has 60 rounds of ammunition, it's extremely unlikely. So you probably shouldn't be expecting Kangi here to be wiping out half of the enemy team by himself. One thing that is worth pointing out, by the way, although it's probably already too late and people are all over it in the comments, is that the MiG-21F, and this is the version that you see here in War Thunder, the MiG-21F-13, had 2, not 1, 30mm guns. They were mounted underneath the fuselage. In fact, you can see the bulge just there at the bottom of the fuselage under the cockpit for one of them. However, they're an upgrade option. When you unlock this aircraft, you get no missiles, and you only get the 1 30mm gun. Oh, and did I mention? It only has 60 rounds of ammunition. The NATO reporting name for this aircraft was typically unglamorous. NATO referred to this aircraft, the MiG-21, as the Fishbed. Still, it could have been worse. The MiG-15 was known as the Faggot. In case you were wondering, yes, you're right, Kangi is flying a very unconventional flight profile here. He's about to go supersonic at an altitude of not much more than 100 meters. And there he goes. That's an effect known as the vapor cone, or the shock collar. It's basically water vapor in the air, condensing as the aircraft passes through the sound barrier. The MiG-21 was designed to be both a fighter and an interceptor, and that's actually kind of ambitious because those are 2 different roles. I mean, an interceptor is a fighter, but a fighter isn't necessarily an interceptor. Oh, and by the way, before we go any further, can we just get a shout out for Gaijin's sound design engineers, because the sound effects of these jet aircraft are nothing short of spectacular. I'm sure we can all at least agree on that. Anyway, back to the whole fighter-interceptor thing. A fighter's job is to achieve air superiority over the battlefield by shooting down primarily enemy fighters, and therefore making things extremely hazardous for enemy reconnaissance and strike aircraft. An interceptor's job is to go after enemy strike and reconnaissance aircraft. An interceptor is basically a point defense aircraft, and for that job it has to be incredibly fast. It has to be capable of scrambling, getting up to attack altitude, and intercepting its target very quickly, something that the MiG-21 was incredibly good at doing. Which is kind of ironic, because Kangi has spent most of this battle at treetop height. But the MiG-21 did a great job as an interceptor, although not without certain limitations. It did have notoriously short legs. Its range was extremely limited. To all practical intents and purposes, when this aircraft was travelling at interception speed, which is what it did as an interceptor, it had a flight endurance of around about 45 minutes. And the arrangement of its fuel tanks wasn't particularly well thought out either. Most of the fuel was carried forward of the centre of gravity, which wasn't a huge issue until you were around about halfway through that 45-minute endurance, more or less at around about the point where you were doing your interception, and the centre of gravity had now shifted, thanks to the fuel being consumed, towards the rear of the aircraft, which made things very interesting for the pilot. But the MiG-21 was not just an interceptor, it was also a fighter, and a fighter's job is to win air superiority, oof, that one was close, against other fighters, and the MiG-21 could do that as well. But while the MiG-21 is a fighter, it's generally not considered to be a dogfighter, and that's down to the peculiarities of the delta wing design, which is optimised for supersonic flight, but it does have certain flight characteristic peculiarities at subsonic speeds that if you know what you're doing, and you're a lot more confident in your abilities than I am, an aircraft like this at subsonic speeds, you can take people by surprise. Let's just watch what Kangi's doing here, because he is subsonic and there is an F4, well, not quite on his tail, but he was able to make the F4 overshoot. Squeezes up a couple of bursts with the 30mm, just a couple of bursts. You have to be very, very careful on the trigger when you only have 60 rounds of ammunition available. He should quite easily be able to catch up to the F4, but you have to keep your head on a swivel here. Make sure there's nobody else sneaking up on you. He seems to be reasonably confident. The ranging radar has got the range to the target. He's closing in, but it looks like the F-86 took the Phantom out instead. Now, this delta wing, which is extremely efficient at supersonic speeds, behaves radically different when you're at subsonic speeds. It generates huge amounts of lift when you're at a high angle of attack, when the nose of the aircraft is pitched up relative to the direction of travel. And all of that lift means that the aircraft actually has a very, very low stall speed. But it generates an enormous amount of drag, which means that in order to not actually stall and crash, you have to have an extremely powerful engine to power through all of the drag created by this delta wing when you're at subsonic speeds and you're either at a high angle of attack or you're maneuvering violently, you're dogfighting. So you can dogfight in the MiG-21, providing you're completely familiar with the flight characteristics of this delta wing at subsonic speeds. If you're not, you're best advised to just keep the throttle open and use this thing as a boom and zoom energy fighter. Now, the Hawker Hunter there clearly realises that the MiG-21 in straight and level flight will do about 1,000 kilometers per hour more than a Hawker Hunter. So he's attempting to make Candy overshoot. But Kangi's anticipated this and he knows his aircraft. And despite the Hawker desperately trying to weave in front of him and force him to overshoot, he's using the massive amounts of drag created by that delta wing at this kind of speed to stay behind him. And if they keep this up, although it's unlikely that the Hunter is going to be able to keep this up for much longer. Yep, there he goes. But if they keep this up, it's entirely likely that the Hunter would have been the one to stall first. Kangi knows his aircraft. Now, just before he finished off the Hunter F1, there was an F-100D Super Sabre just took off from the airfield over. Oh, there he is. Kangi didn't take any chances. He just put the nose down, floored the throttle, and did his usual, almost supersonic treetop level thing. But here comes the F-100. Kangi cannot have a huge amount of ammunition left. And he's going to basically do more or less exactly the same thing to the F-100 as he did to the Hunter F1. They're two radically different aircraft, of course. The Hawker Hunter is very powerful and very heavy. The F-100 is a bit more like the MiG-21. It's certainly not as fast as the MiG-21, but it's nowhere near as heavy as a Hunter F1. Now, conventional wisdom would have you assuming that in a traditional low-altitude, low-speed turning and burning dogfight, the F-100 Super Sabre would win against a MiG-21. And in most circumstances, you'd probably be absolutely 100% correct, and you should put your money on the F-100. But Kangi really knows this aircraft. And I want you to just watch what happens, because this is the last aircraft remaining on the enemy team. The F-100 is the only thing they have left. None of Kangi's teammates are interested in coming over here and helping him out, so this is very much a one-on-one dogfight between a supersonic interceptor capable of speeds in excess of Mach 2 fighting a low-altitude subsonic turning and burning dogfight above an enemy airfield against an aircraft that should, theoretically, hold all the cards. And the F-100 pilot is not bad. He's managed to get on Kangi's tail, and he is about to launch a heat seeker. There it goes. Yep, he does have sidewinders. That one was narrowly avoided. And you really don't want to be in front of an aircraft armed with heat seekers at this kind of range when you're using your afterburner. Kangi kind of has to use the afterburner, however, because of all of that drag created by this delta wing at subsonic speeds, and oh shit, that was close. But don't forget the subsonic flight characteristics of this delta wing. Massive amounts of lift, very, very low stall speed. Normally, you've got to keep the engine going at full afterburner to provide the thrust necessary to counteract all of that drag, but what if you want to be going very slow because you have such a very slow stall speed thanks to all of the lift created by that delta wing, and even more lift now that he's using his flaps. And if you cast your mind back to my last War Thunder video, which featured the F-100, remember that the F-100 also has some peculiar flight characteristics of its own, particularly when it's at low altitude and low speed and at a high angle of attack. A phenomenon known as the saber dance could occur, where the nose would pitch up, killing all of your lift, generating a huge amount of drag, and resulting in particularly nasty and messy crashes. Almost exactly like that one. So, I did warn you that today's video was not going to be like the usual 15 kill streak War Thunder air realistic battles that I tend to show you here, because Kangi's in a MiG-21, he's only got 60 rounds of ammunition, so Kangi got one kill and then forced the F-100 down. But I hope you enjoyed it anyway, mostly because Kangi's mastery of this aircraft was absolutely spectacular to watch, or at least I thought so, and hopefully you guys agree with me too, because that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.